To remain updated with the latest business news, click on the bell icon.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Business Today, and on this edition, I'm joined by a very special guest. With me is Mr. Karan Bhasin. He's a policy researcher. Thank you so much, Karan, for taking out time, and you're joining in from United States in freezing temperatures of minus 19 degrees, you told me, and you're not even keeping well. But thank you so much, despite that, taking out time for us. And this is an important conversation, and just ahead of the budget, I want to begin by asking you, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear budget 2022? Are you expecting it to be a status quo, or do you believe this budget will definitely do something to fuel more growth into the economy?
Hi, Sakshi. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you. The coming budget, of course, is quite an important one for various reasons. Uh, but my expectation is kind of timbered down. It's kind of not, I'm not expecting a big bang budget. And the reason is that we had a big bang budget just last year. So there are a lot of realistic limitations on what can be done given the kind of macro environment where we are in. Of course, our fiscal deficit is much higher. Our debt to GDP ratio is much higher than previously. Again, so there's very limited room. And then there are rate hikes that are happening across the world, which also squeezes, any additional space that could be available on the monetary policy front. That being said, the most important thing that I will be looking for in this budget uh, is the more macro vision going forward that the government has for the next couple of years. Because according to me, I think the next couple of years are going to have a very choppy kind of volatile environment in general. So that's one thing that I'm going to be looking for. Um Otherwise, I think the economic recovery has been doing well. Of course, there are concerns about it being uneven, and some of it is, I think, a bit too premature. Some of it is genuine, and there are those concerns as well. Uh, but largely, I think it's nothing that cannot be managed.
Right. And yes, you're right. There has been a lot of commentary about the nature of India's economic recovery post the pandemic, first wave, second wave, and now we are undergoing the third wave as well. People are talking about a K-shaped recovery. Some are talking about a V-shaped recovery as well. What has your view been as far as the nature of economic recovery we have seen so far? And can the government really introduce or announce some steps in the budget that could actually get into a sustainable economic recovery path going forward from here?
My understanding, and this is again based on extensively looking at economic crises that we have had in the recent past across the world, and I don't see a uniform recovery in most countries. It's a very rare thing to get a uniform recovery where, you have a situation where everything's fine, every sector is doing well, people across income distributions are doing well. That's actually very, very, very difficult to engineer from a policy response point of view. But yes, the present recovery, I think, has had an impact more on the contact services sector. And this is something that probably, we've been saying since the first time we started discussing this way back in 2020, that sectors such as transportation, tourism, primarily tourism and hospitality, they've had it the worst coming compared to others. And I think some form of support extended to them, even if it is an extension of ECLGS, which might not be a quintessential fiscal policy intervention, but it is at the end of the day a credit support, right? So restaurants can probably borrow more without any additional collateral. I think that might be a good thing to consider, because we now know that ECLGS has been successful in preventing massive bankruptcies. And when people talk about credit guarantees, they always say that, okay, but it's like you are incentivizing me to borrow more. I have to repay. Uh, so there is that thing that, you are asking me to borrow rather than giving me some support. But the point is that if you get that borrowing at a concessional rate, it makes it easier for you to restart your business. And I think that's one thing that is definitely something that we should consider to avoid a uneven shaped recovery. I see a lot of commentary about inequality rising during the pandemic. Unfortunately, that doesn't show up in data.
Okay.
Right. And that's a very surprising thing, because, people are talking about it.
Yes.
There's an Oxfam report and everything. And of course, Oxfam report is not how inequality is measured typically, because they're looking at stock markets, and, stock markets have been down. So what happens? Did inequality go down over the last couple of days? Obviously not. So there are those methodological issues. But in fact, three of people in the US have published a paper, a working paper at the National Bureau of Economic Research, working paper series
Yeah.
on India, on inequality actually going down during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's kind of a interesting finding. And we know from
Mm.
past as well that even in 2017, the ISDS survey, which is done by the NCAER, National
Mm.
Council of Applied Economic Research, that
Mm.
also showed that inequality was going down. And we're talking about consumption inequality, income inequality, not typically the wealth inequality that is often discussed by Oxfam, etc.
Right.
Uh, so I think India's recovery, even though it has been, when we look at sectors, very uneven and not balanced, but on the inequality front, it has kind of been more balanced, and people
Okay.
saw the economic impact distributed across the income distribution. So at least that's one area where we should be uh, a bit better than some of the other emerging markets.
Yes, absolutely. That would be a breather. But the other major factor that all the economists definitely look at in the budget is the fiscal deficit number. Now, speaking about fiscal deficit in the coming year, of course, we may not see the same degree of monetary policy support given the fact that what the Fed is doing in terms of talking about rate hikes, and similar things may happen in India. So how much fiscal room, I want to understand from you, do you think the government really has to keep pushing growth ahead?
Right. I am a bit concerned about the availability of fiscal room because, of course,
Mm.
interest rates are going up and so are government bond yields,
Yeah.
which means that the cost of borrowing for the government has increased significantly compared to the bottom that it experienced during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it borrowed a lot during that particular period.
Hmm.
So essentially, we have a situation where government's cost of borrowing has increased. And when I look at, when I look at the entire scenario, I think it's prudent to expect some form of fiscal consolidation in the present financial year. But that might not be because the government is not spending, that might be more because of the buoyancy in tax revenues. Uh, I would think that a figure of 5.8 might be a realistic fiscal
Okay.
target towards the end of the year. Of course, it's a very
Okay.
optimistic target.
Right.
But I think that's the number that they should be going for, given that a lot of the disinvestment proceeds could
Hmm.
not happen this year, so they have to happen again next year.
Yes. Yes.
So that
Absolutely.
that gap, of course, might show a lower deficit in the next financial year, even though it might show a higher one when the actual numbers for this year are out.
Right.
Uh,
Absolutely. Now, I want to understand from you, just because the budget also comes right ahead of these 5 state elections, do you think the government would be more tilted towards announcing populist measures instead of big reforms this time around?
that's a concern, although I don't see space for announcing anything populist anymore. So
Hmm.
they're again limited by the options available. So it's if they want to go the populist route, they will have to cut some capex, and they cannot afford to
Yeah.
cut capex because that has an impact on the growth cycle.
Right.
Having said that, our food subsidy bill, in fact, our poverty alleviation or welfare bill has actually gone up
Hmm.
significantly over the last 2.5 years.
Hmm.
So it would not be advisable to increase it any further, because even though a lot of this was necessary, a lot of it was
Yeah.
income support to the bottom poor, free food grains, etc. But
Hmm.
now that the economy is back opening up, jobs are coming back, incomes are recovering, do we really need to extend the same level of support that we extended during the initial
Yeah.
days of the pandemic? And I think that's where a lot of disagreement also happens, because there's the other side which talks about expanding the social net.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
but again, at the end, it's a question of trade-offs. You're constrained by the resources you have. You have a set of tax revenues. You can borrow so much. So those things are also important considerations to keep in mind.
So,
Right.
just last 2 more questions. I want to understand from you, what are the key challenges that face the finance minister right now, right ahead of the budget, keeping in mind that the third wave of Omicron is still in way? Will that, and how it is really impacting the economic recovery at this current stage, will that weigh heavily on finance minister right ahead of the budget?
Well, I mean, the Omicron's impact has been fairly limited, and then that's again, visible from all the leading indicators data that we have. But of course, there is a looming question of whether we need to give a third dose to everyone. Right now, we have, of course, started the preventive dose for certain set of identified groups which are at risk, but if it has to be expanded, then it has to be accounted for in the budget. So there's some amount of provisioning for that. But the bigger threat, I believe, is from the external sector, because we don't know what's going to happen in March, what is going to be the quantum of the rate hike. Now, there are, of course, concerns about a rate hike having an impact like it did in 2013. I don't expect that, because, of course, we have a much healthier reserve position. Our policies are much more conducive, but there will be a capital mobility, volatility in general.
Yeah.
People will move away from equities, even in emerging markets, and invest in bonds and stocks, etc. And that creates a lot of volatility in the international markets. Certain exchange, emerging markets will go through exchange pressures. India might not be one of them, but there will be other emerging markets. And then there's, of course, slowdown in China. And as advanced economies raise rates, growth is going to slow as well in those parts of the world. So typically, I think we are overestimating growth at the moment for the current financial year. It might be slower than what the estimates are right now globally. And that will have a bearing on our exports, and that will also have a bearing on what happens in the commodities prices and commodity
Correct.
markets. So those are the kind of risks that I see that again have to be well balanced. And my understanding is that a lot of it can be done by prudent intervention, timely intervention, both by the RBI and the finance ministry. And unfortunately, none of that can be taken into consideration during the budget, because there are so many scenarios that can play out over the next couple of months.
Okay, so perhaps major steps outside of the budget is something that we would be awaiting. But lastly, what could be the big thumbs up and what would be the big thumbs down for you in the upcoming budget?
A big thumbs up would be nothing new at all. I think I would be very happy if it's a business as usual budget.
Okay.
And if they stick with the fiscal consolidation plan. Modest tax cuts might still be, again, something that might be a thumbs up. Tax hikes across the board in any case might be a thumbs down. Also, I would be interested to see what happens to duties and whether duties generally go up or go down. My understanding is that they'll correct for inverted duty structure, so some duties might go up, some duties might go down. But I do not expect a hard turn towards protectionism in the current financial budget. So again, that's again something that is worth looking forward to.
Okay, and what would be a thumbs down?
As I said, a tax hike would be in general a thumbs down.
Okay,
Any tax hike would be a thumbs down. Right.
Absolutely understood that. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Karan, for taking out time for us and enlightening us with what to expect from the upcoming budget, the scenarios that the finance minister may be considering while she presents her fourth budget in this term of Modi government as well. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you with us on Business Today. Hope to catch you up again on Economic Survey and post the budget as well. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Sakshi. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.